Over the last 20 years, there have been huge changes in how rivers are managed across Asia and globally. The river, once a backdrop to development, has become a forefront of urban development. Dasha River Ecological Corridor runs about 13.7 kilometers along the Dasha River, from its origin at Changlingpi Reservoir in Yangtai Mountain to its mouth at Shenzhen Bay, creating almost 100 hectares of new riverside park in the city center of Shenzhen. How is this large-scale ecological plan formulated? What should be considered when setting ecological objectives in urbanized landscape projects?
My education background is in ecology and environmental management. I've got a BSc and then I did a PhD in freshwater ecology in Hong Kong. And then since then, I graduated from my PhD in 2000 or 2001. And since then, I've been working as an ecologist or an environmental planner in various AECOM companies. We were involved in this project, I think, from 2016, maybe. It was around that time, so I'm guessing that would be one of the later stages. The earlier stages, one of the main things that they were focusing on, I think, was the water quality, as they've upgraded a lot of the wastewater treatment plants. And then also put in kind of grey water collectors along the river, so that there's no direct discharge of very dirty water into the river anymore. So I think that was one of the first things that they did in terms of the river transformation. And that was very much a focus on the engineering. We were brought in at that stage probably because if you have very, very poor water quality, it's a very big constraint in terms of ecology, in terms of what you can do with the river. So once they had the water quality improved to a certain level, it gives you more flexibility for increasing ecological value.
How did experts from different majors participate in identifying the site issues of the project?
For ecological design on landscape projects, I think our process is quite similar on many of the projects that we work on. We collect baseline information is the first thing that we do. Then we try and identify what our key objectives would be for the site based on the data that we have in hand. And then we work with our design team to understand, how we can achieve those key objectives and goals. So I think this is maybe a little bit different from landscape designers, and something that they would need to understand is collecting the baseline data is often a very time-consuming and intensive effort. We had teams going out to survey all of the fish and the frogs and the insects living in the stream, the vegetation, and also all of the terrestrial fauna and flora that are using the areas adjacent to the streams, plus any kind of desktop information that's available. And when we're looking at ecology, we often try to identify the most kind of sensitive areas in terms of ecology, where maybe you don't want as many people or as high a level of human activity in those areas. And so the focus is more on biodiversity. And then you can identify other areas where maybe there's less ecologically sensitive receivers in those areas, and you can those can be allocated for more human activities, and then typically some buffer zone in between those areas. So once we have that kind of basic framework in place, we then need to discuss with the design team. So I think an example for Dasha was there was a remnant kind of orchard habitat alongside the river with some. I mean, it wasn't very interesting, really. It was not hugely interesting in terms of ecology, but something that we thought we should try and retain and enhance. So as part of the ecological planning, we wanted to make sure that that area was preserved and enhanced through better planting, and also provisions put in place to allow people to do some bird watching in that area without disturbing the birds and other animals that are living in that area. So we could work with our design team to make sure that those existing habitats are preserved, and then coming up with a design that's going to enhance that in terms of the ecological value, but then also provide some additional kind of ecotourism facilities for people as well.
How does the city center location of Dasha affect the setting of ecological goals for this project?
when we're setting targets for ecology, you always need to be aware of the context and what is going to be feasible to be in terms of ecological targets for your site. So this project here is right in the middle of the city. So although you're going to have some intertidal areas that potentially with low disturbance could attract very rare species, maybe like black-faced spoonbills, because of the levels of disturbance in this area, whatever you do, you're never going to get those types of species occurring on the site. So this again is something that you need to understand in terms of your site analysis, in terms of what kind of habitats you can create and what potentially could be attracted to that site and could be supported by the site. So for these types of very urbanized projects, you have to focus on species and habitats that you know are going to be reasonably tolerant of disturbance. One species we often recommend for these kind of urban areas, there's quite a few species of starling, which is a type of bird, which used to be very common in rural South China. They nest in holes in walls in kind of village houses and things like that. But as this area has become very rapidly urbanized, the habitats that these species use has kind of disappeared. So the populations have plummeted for this particular species of bird. But we do know that they used to live in village environments, so they're not that bothered by people. As long as you provide sufficient food sources and places to nest, they should be able to use habitats like we have at Dasha and the park areas adjacent to the river should be suitable habitats for these type of species. So you're trying to match the conditions that you have with the target species that you're selecting for the project. And always for those target species selection, you're trying to add value. People think that if you attract any species of bird or any species of butterfly to a project, then it's an ecological project and that's a big success. But it's very easy to do that, to attract some birds or some butterflies. Any kind of greenery, that's going to happen. Where you're adding value is if the species or habitats that you're providing within your design have some conservation or other kind of value, or recreational value, educational value. So I think this is where the ecologists can help the landscape designers quite a lot, is in that kind of initial stage.
What challenges or constraints did the project encounter during the ecological planning phase?
The biggest constraint for this project was just the requirement for the client to finish this within a certain time frame. This is quite common, especially in China. Getting a project of that size and complexity finished in the time frame that it was a major achievement. That would not have been possible without the kind of existing working relationships that we had with our design team. I used to work for an econ firm called Edor a long time ago. And in Asia, Edor were basically a landscape design firm when they first started out in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s. But they quickly evolved this, what they called a deep model for all kinds of projects that they worked on, which was design, economy, environment, and planning. So they had people from different disciplines, from landscape design, urban planning and design, economic planning, and environmental planning, all collaborating on all kinds of projects. So Edor were probably one of the first firms to take up this type of integrated approach in Asia. So we try and incorporate those different viewpoints from a very early stage. I think we do a lot of, obviously there's a lot of just simple communications, but quite a lot of workshopping as well. It's good to have everybody around the table, as well as the clients, to go through particular design issues, to bring up key issues and key points, and to make sure everybody understands what the requirements are from each discipline. I think one of the things that is an issue for all kinds of ecology-focused projects is it is often better to adopt a more adaptive management approach to the project rather than a typical design delivery, kind of linear design approach where you have your concept design, schematic, detailed design, construction drawings, and then it's built, and then it's finished. Oftentimes when you're introducing these more ecological elements, there are more uncertainties in the performance. So we can design, say, for example, we wanted to attract a certain species of bird to the site. We think we can do it, based on the information that we have. We think we can create suitable conditions for this species. But after the design is completed, the bird doesn't show up. So it's better that we have a period of monitoring and some adaptability built into the design, so we can come back and try and figure out if the results that we were anticipating did not happen. We can try and understand why that didn't happen, and we have some flexibility in the design to go back and change a few things to see if we can improve that in the long term. So this is still not a very common approach for many landscape typologies that we see. I think is a bit of an issue, is that we don't really have that flexibility or involvement in the project to come back and kind of tweak things at a later date. Yeah, for Dasha, there was some ecological monitoring done. The client has engaged a local university to do the follow-up ecological monitoring. But again, this was a constraint of the project, is that once the design for this one was finished, we didn't have too much involvement after that in terms of the ecological management and monitoring.
What are some adaptive management or monitoring trials that you think can be done in Dasha or other river restoration projects in China?
For some river restoration projects in Hong Kong, we have done site trials to look at wetland vegetation or other types of vegetation that will grow in the channels. So a big issue we have for these types of river projects in South China is obviously the flow rates in the rivers is not constant. In the wintertime, the flow rates can be very, very low. And this is exacerbated because the upstream of all of these rivers is usually dammed. So there's very little flow coming down in the dry season. But then in the wet season, obviously we have big storm events and you get huge volumes of water coming down these channels. So the flow conditions are very, very different seasonally. So we have done trials using different types of wetland vegetation to see, what kind of species can tolerate those conditions in Hong Kong, and which ones we should be using for planting in these types of river projects. But I don't think there was anything done specifically for Dasha herb. In Shenzhen is very interesting, is that they have positioned their wastewater treatment plants for not just Dasha herb, but all of their major rivers. The new wastewater treatment plants are located about halfway along the rivers. So all of the treated wastewater is discharged into the river, providing a very, very significant amount of flow in those rivers. So if you look at the Dasha, maybe the bottom 1 or 2 kilometers, there's absolutely loads of water, even in the dry season. It's quite clever and a good solution.